So for this week's video, I'm starting a new project that's somewhat similar in the sense that it's a cabinet-based project, but it's going to be a banquette. It's not going to be standard cabinets with drawers and drawers. It's essentially a bench. Banquette is a word they use to describe a bench specifically made for a certain space, which this is. So you could see I took the trouble of going to the site and making a template. If you're making something like this, especially as you can see I have angles, this is my template in the space. It's going to be impossible to get it to fit perfectly without going and taking really good measurements, and I just find having a template to work off of really makes room for error essentially disappear. So the front of this is going to have a base which the whole bench will be leveled on top of, and that base thickness is going to be based off of the molding in the space. I have a piece of the molding, it's 3 inches, but I'm going to make mine a little bit shorter so the molding actually wraps onto the top edge of the banquette. So I'm making my entire base 2 3/4 inch. I'm making all of this out of scrap ply, so I just pulled a pile of 3/4 inch pieces I had that would work dimensionally speaking with what I was going for, and just ripped it all into 2 3/4 inch pieces. Now you could see as I was making the template, I was trying to devise a way in order to make this as square as possible, because angles just complicate everything. I could have easily built this whole thing in half the time if it was a square box versus angles, but the math just wouldn't work. I essentially had to go about and break this into angles, so that's all I'm showing you right here. Is I made my intersecting point essentially where those angles are going to be on the wall, and then found that angle. So the first angle I'm going to be working off of is the middle section, and I used a bevel gauge to find that. You're going to need that for something like this, and essentially it turned out to be a 20-degree angle. I can go about starting to cut all of my pieces. I cut the back angle first, and then I can mark on my template where to cut the front. Also going to be 20 degrees, but they're going to be facing in different directions, which will be important for the rest of the build. So pretty simple stuff just to start with, making those angled pieces, lining this up perfectly with the template. For the base at least, I'm focusing on making it a really tight fit. I want this to butt up against the wall perfectly, and like you saw in the photos, I made the template fit up against that wall as close as I could, so I'm pretty much going exact off of this. In order to join my other pieces, I prefer dados and rabbets for stuff like this. You do not have to do that. You can make all of these butt joints. It'll save you some time. You're still going to have to cut those angles, obviously, but for mine, I'm cutting angled rabbets on all of my edges. I tried doing that on the radial arm saw first, but it would involve changing the angle of the radial arm saw, which is doable, but it can be a real pain to dial it back into square. So I put a dado stack in my table saw, change that angle to 20 degrees, which is going to be throughout all of my cuts, and you saw I just notched out the corners. Once I have the corners notched, it's easy. My straightaway has no cuts to it, so I could just plop them in place, and this is my first shape. Now, I like to have as much structural support on stuff like this as possible, especially because this is a bench, and especially because I know kids are going to be using the bench. If you're making anything for the younger population, they are the roughest people to exist around furniture. If you've ever observed young children around furniture or objects in general, they're just not going to be gentle with them. So I specifically overbuilt this, which I would do in general, but it's something to mention. Usually what I do for dados and rabbets is I could just make them symmetrical and I could come off the edge at the same distance, but because my front is obviously shorter than my back, you saw I cut one first, and then I could transfer those marks to the back of my piece and cut that as well. But then the whole thing fits together. It's going to hold itself together pretty well without any hardware, which is nice. I don't want to sink a bunch of screws into this stuff. It's just plywood. Even with countersinking, screws just don't hold very well in composites, plywood, stuff like that. So all I'm going to do is put glue on all of my joints and then sink some brads into all of my pieces. As that glue sets up, this will dry to be pretty sturdy and I could continue building off of it. So at this point, because I had multiple layers of my template, it didn't set on the top of it very nicely, so I'm using the flat surface of my table in the back here in order to just get everything aligned and put together. But I'll make sure to transfer it back to the template, square it up, make sure it sets on there as the glue dries. So that's what my middle piece looks like. Now the two edges are going to be done the exact same way. The only two differences are obviously the shapes are a little bit different, but the angle is 25 degrees. I just went about and did this the exact same way. It's the exact same process. I just changed the degree on my saws to 25. And because I had that first one done, I knew the process at this point, so I made my two angled side cuts first. And then because the edges are square, that was where it gets a little simple. I could just go through and put a rabbet on my two edges. So you can see with that angled cut, it's now a straightaway shooting towards the side. And then the side is going to meet this flat piece with flat rabbets. And like I said, same process. I can now measure in between my joints, make those cuts, and do the dados in order to join everything. I didn't film all that because like I said, it's the exact same process. Once all of these were glued, I could clamp them together, screw them together, which I'll also do in the space, and then I could just test my template on top of it before I move that to the side. I don't like to throw stuff like that out until I'm done with the project, just in case I need it, but you can see that it's pretty much perfectly matched to the template I got in the space, which is going to be really important for stuff like this and fitting it. In order to start the upper cabinets, I went and marked a 1/4 inch around the entire perimeter of my piece. There's going to be some molding on the front of this that will come to the front face of my base. It's also going to be on the sides, but I'm giving myself some wiggle room on the back as well as where all of my pieces meet, because the base isn't that big of a deal. There's not a large contact surface between that and the wall, and my template's accurate enough, I'm not worried about it. But the rest of the cabinet, you do want to give yourself room to scribe and room to move the cabinets in case the wall's not square. So basically the height of the chairs that are already in the room are 18 inches. I'm probably going to have 2 to 3 inches worth of a foam pad on the top of this. I'm essentially making one big top side face frame, which will be 3/4, and also subtracting my base gives me 11.5 inches for that big middle cabinet. Because I'm probably going to get 3-inch foam, the foam's not going to stay 3 inches once you sit on it, so I decided to actually round that up to about 12 inches. So that is what I'm doing. I now have red oak ply that I'm ripping into roughly 12-inch pieces. I had a 4-foot piece, so in order to get 4 sections, it's actually a little less than 12. And I'm using red oak ply because I had enough scrap that I can make all these topside cabinets, and also because when I talked to the customer, we hadn't decided if it was going to be painted or stained yet. So since I had the oak, I'm just going to make it out of oak, and oak it stains really well, but it could also be painted, so it's a win-win before that decision is made. And then I just went and I marked my widths of all of my front sections. The fronts are going to essentially be one solid piece, so all I did was measure from where my base was and out, and those are my 3 pieces. So you'll see there will be little gaps in the middle because obviously I haven't cut these on an angle, and unlike the base, I decided to cut the fronts first. Even though I'm putting molding on the front, I didn't want there to be any large seams in the front. And also because I kind of learned from the base, I had to cut 2 different angles on the front and the back because the angles were facing different ways. If I'm cutting the angles on my front pieces, it's the same angle. It makes it a little bit simpler. So in order to account for that angle, all I did was put a piece on the top, as you can see. I essentially went from corner to corner, and I'm just going to cut this angle here. Same exact process. The middle one's 20 degrees. I can set my dado stack to 20 degrees and send those pieces through. So I didn't get great footage of that. You'll have to see the back side, but that is essentially the dado. I just lined it up with my marks using some scrap. For the back side, the same as when I did the sides. I had to move the fence to the left-hand side in order to cut that. Same process, it's just the angle's facing a different way, so I needed to be on the other side of the blade, and that is what those dado looks like. So it's the same thing for the front. Obviously, I'm changing the degrees as I move between the compartments, but the ones in the front I was able to cut where my wood was on the left-hand side of the fence, but then for the backs I had to move it to the other side, and then I could go through and, like I'm showing here, keep changing the angle. So for the edges, a little simpler. It's just a regular straight rabbet, so I have my sacrificial fence in the table saw, and I could cut that rabbet. And I made this entire thing that you're seeing, and I had a late start to the day in a day. The angles can be a little bit complicated, but once you get going, it was faster. And doing the angles on the front side instead of the sides was also a little bit easier. So if you're making something like this and you're starting with your base, you can also switch that up if you would prefer. I did find doing it that way a little bit easier. And then right now I just have scrap in there to kind of hold them in place. But with everything in place, I can make sure they're standing plumb, and then measure front to back, and then slide my partitions in place. Now, like I said, I got a late start on this. I was out of the shop almost all week working on a large kitchen install I've been in the process of doing. So I wanted to get the bases on these as well, the bottom parts of the cabinets, but I didn't get to it for this video. But this will probably be maybe one more part. It's not a big piece of furniture, and you could see what those sections look like. It's worth it to make these because now the customer is going to get as much storage as possible by spending the time to make all those angles instead of squaring off these boxes and leaving large voids in the center, which would be easier to do, but like I said, you'll lose a lot of storage doing it that way. With everything in place, you can see it lines up perfectly with my mark, so I'm ready to add the moldings to the front once this is glued together.